Okay, well here we are, back at Playing Pedagogies in the Early Years, and this is topic 8. In this topic we're going to be looking at inclusive practices. Specifically we're going to define some key terms used around the policies and practitioners' language when they talk about inclusivity. And we're going to look at some of the links, the important links between policies and practices in this area. This is very important for you to know the policies that guide your work in this area. And we're going to look at some of the elements of inclusive practices, and particularly in this short presentation, the notion of creating a supportive environment. Just looking at your background reading from Keyes-Adair and Doucet, there are lots of really salient points in this reading, but I've just pulled out a few for you to consider. And if you haven't come to the conclusion that you understand how these points have been raised in the reading, then it's probably a good idea to go back and read the chapter again. So for me, the things that were really important in this chapter was that understanding that play is a way that children, that for us to understand how children see society. So that to me has associated obligations and, I guess, ethics for us to let children play if we're truly interested in child-centred pedagogies. Then observing play and not intervening in play or directing play constantly is a really important aspect of our work, and helps us to understand how children do see society and the things that they say. The distinction there about cultural definitions is made again, the assumption that all children need and want to play, and whether they all play in the same way, I think is dealt with quite nicely in this chapter. There's an interesting conversation in the chapter about the ways in which whiteness is normalised in early childhood settings, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally. And it kind of brought to mind to me the work that's been done around the influences of popular media, which we'll be talking about next week really, but around things like Disney and how Disney uses colour to depict good and bad. White is good and black is bad, and how that trickles or ripples through children's understandings of the world. They also talk about play not being neutral, and that play can be risky, which I think is an important understanding for us, particularly later when we're talking about creating these supportive environments for children. Some conversation about the role of adults in play, and that play is connected to ideas about race and culture, and there's quite a lot of information in the chapter about that. Okay, so just starting off thinking about some of the key words that we need to come to terms with or have a shared understanding about. These are snapshots from the Early Years Learning Framework, and you'll see in the reference list these are the EYLF postcards. You can download these by clicking on the link. So what does inclusion mean in terms of the Early Years Learning Framework? It is a term that aims to make everyone feel welcome, valued and accepted, regardless of their age, culture, background or ability. Now, sometimes in other contexts, inclusion is associated with disabilities, so including children who have disabilities. It has a broader application and understanding in this context. So being inclusive means making sure that everyone is treated fairly and that no one is left out. Sometimes the practice of inclusion is used to refer specifically to how we work with children with additional needs, which is the point I just made. In the Early Years Learning Framework, it's used in relation to how we work with all children and is closely related to the idea of belonging. Now, I'm not going to go through these, but these are really good reflective points for you to consider as you travel through this PowerPoint. So what then is diversity? Diversity, it means valuing and reflecting the practices, values and beliefs of families. Now, that's important that we're talking about the values and beliefs of families, not necessarily the educators, although one would hope that they aligned in some way, but looking to the family and valuing and reflecting their practices, values and beliefs. To create a true sense of belonging, we need to show respect and understanding for each child and their family's unique background, culture and beliefs. By welcoming and including diversity, we help to make each child and family feel a part of the service. So again, there's some interesting points there. So diversity is more than just being different. Diversity is a celebration of the many unique attributes that children and their families bring to a particular setting, and the educators as well. Well-being, if you have studied Introduction to Teaching, you will have come across this term before. Well-being includes good physical health, feelings of happiness, satisfaction, and social functioning. But it's more than that. It's a strong sense that provides children with confidence and optimism to maximise their learning potential. Now, if you remember the work of Anne Graham and her associates, well-being is about feeling good about yourself, knowing that people, recognition, drawing on Axel Honneth's work, someone who knows me and likes me is really important to children. Feeling good about yourself in a particular environment. It's closely linked to their own sense of identity and their feelings of self-esteem and self-worth, and includes, of course, the physical attributes. But it's not just about the physical; it's about the emotional as well. And again, there's some really important questions there for you to think about. Part of this conversation of inclusion is wrapped around the centrality in the early years learning framework of having partnerships with families, establishing genuine partnerships and relationships with families. And it's referenced on page 9 that children thrive when families and educators work together in partnership to support children's learning. So partnerships with families begin with strong relationships. Sharing something meaningful about a child's day is a powerful way to make a connection. Families already have their child's best interests at heart. When they see that you do that as well, it helps to build trust and respect. So how do we build relationships with the families of the children in our care? It's not always that easy, but it's something that is, as I said, quite central to that notion of belonging, and quite critical when we're talking about inclusion and inclusive practices. We've looked at this concept before and how it sits in the early years learning framework. Cultural competence is about understanding your own culture first and what assumptions and beliefs that your cultural heritage and experiences bring to the learning environment, but also being open and respectful to other cultures. Being culturally competent helps us recognise how important culture is to our beliefs and ways of doing things. It also helps us to understand the importance of cultures to others. So culture is central to our feelings of being and belonging and our sense of identity. So if we're talking about inclusion being a celebration of difference and diversity, then obviously we need to be mindful that for us to be displaying cultural competence as educators, we would need to be very mindful of the way our own background shapes our beliefs of what we do, how things are done around here, and how the children's and their families' cultures and beliefs shape what they do. And if they aren't the same, then how we work together to kind of reconcile that. Okay, so there are the key terms that we need to be aware of. I just want to spend some time in this presentation talking to you about some of the links between policies and practices, because they're quite significant. They have major implications on your work, and it takes us in that field beyond ethics to legalities. So some of them are regulatory frameworks, some of them are accreditation matters, some deal with children with disabilities, some deal with families and children generally, but they're all around social inclusion, building social inclusion. So, as we said, we've got our national frameworks, which we know are the Early Years Learning Framework, and for the out of school, we've got the out of school care, we've got the My Time, Our Place framework. So, the inclusion of all children in high quality programs is linked to all 5 principles in the Early Years Learning Framework. They're also linked to the national quality standards, and they're in the guiding principles and the following elements: Quality Area 1, Standard 1.1, Quality Area 5, Standard 5.1. So that's the NQS from ASIQA, and again, things that you will be held accountable to in your role as a professional. Again, as a teacher and an educator, regardless as of next year, whether you're in the private school setting or the school setting, you will be professionally accredited and be accountable against the Australian Professional Standards for Teachers. Now, again, all of those professional standards, if you read through them, linked very closely to this notion of inclusion. So where did all this come from? Where did this notion of inclusion start, if you like, or this raft of policies and legislation? If you remember, again, we talked about the Melbourne Declaration in 2008. The Council of Australian Governments, COAG, adopted a vision that by 2020 all children in Australia would have the best start in life in order to create a better future for them and the nation. So that vision, that aspirational document, has led to many things, many developments, including certain legislation, regulations and legislative bodies, that strategies that are now in existence. These are mentioned in the introduction to the Early Years Learning Framework, and some of those peak bodies are listed on this screen. So it's a national agenda of social inclusion. There are legislative and regulatory requirements, as I've said. All providers of early childhood education and care services are required by law and community obligation to include children with disabilities, children from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. Now, it's not just a nice thing to do. You're actually legally required by the Disability Discrimination Act and the Anti-Discrimination Act that you cannot discriminate. Obviously, they prohibit the discrimination of children on the basis of disability, culture, or indigeneity. Legislation that you will become very familiar with as you work in the sector, both sectors. That applies to the private school and school sector. More recent legislation is the National Disability Insurance Scheme. So these are the reforms that support people with a disability to be integrated into all sorts of settings, including early years settings, and that information and legislation is an ongoing thing for people working in the early years sector. There's a link to the NDIS website if you want to know more about that. I'm really just putting before you a raft of the policies and practices without going into any of them in too much detail. Inclusive practice embraces the idea that all children have the same rights and opportunities as each other. So if we're talking about inclusive practice, we look at every different environment as each service responds to the different needs of each child. Early childhood services consider each child's best interests in order to support their healthy development, learning and well-being. Now, inclusive practice, I think it's important, I'll just say that again, embraces the idea that all children have the same rights and opportunities as each other, that they cannot be discriminated against or treated differently on the basis of any attribute that they may bring to that service with them. An inclusive approach is responsive to children and their families. So as educators, we need to be flexible in our approach and respond to individual children's strengths, interests and needs. And you can see there's 3 criteria there that your program must include. So you must give children with a disability the opportunity to participate in the same range of experiences that other children are being offered, to build and develop on the strengths of all participants, including the child, their families and the community, and to celebrate the achievements of all children. Inclusive practice is regular practice. It's not something that we do at particular points in time. It's embedded in everything that we do, and it's just drawn here. This slide draws on the joint paper written by the Early Childhood Australia and the Early Childhood Intervention Australia, 2 peak bodies, of course, in the early years, published a position statement on the inclusion of children, in particular with disabilities. The position statement is again referenced in the reference list for these slides and is easily accessible for you to download on the website. So every child's entitled to access and participate in an early childhood program which recognises them as active agents in their own lives. They can to respond to them as individuals and to respect their families and partners and engage with their diverse backgrounds and cultures. So why inclusive practice? Why not do what we did once upon a time and have special services and practices for children with additional needs or with diverse needs? Again, the position statement's pretty clear about this and has a set of principles that inclusive practice is in the best interests of the child, celebrates the importance of families, is focused on social inclusion, and is central at the place of evidence-based practice. So we're talking about, I guess, another key term we could have defined at the beginning of this is this notion of access, that all children have access to the learning, the services that other children are able to access. So this notion of social inclusion, early childhood services have a major role to play. As we can see, comprehensive research tells us that early childhood years are critical in laying the foundations for future development in children's cognitive, social and emotional development. So positive experiences for children with disabilities and their families, as for all children and their families, are crucial to building that solid foundation. Inclusion is a protective factor for children's mental health and well-being, and it's closely linked to their self-esteem. The other thing that this slide does not say, but is very important, is that a positive experience and a normality, I suppose, a normal experience of children interacting with each other and understanding difference as a strength, not seen to be abnormal, seeing diversity as normal, not abnormal, is a really powerful role position for children to be to come out of those early years with. Now, inclusion is the core of our work, and it's not a specialist topic about children with disability. It's about all children, and I guess I've made that point several times. That means that we think about this constantly through our curriculum decision making, and if we've got children with physical requirements that need to be taken into consideration, then you do that. If they're linguistic requirements, then that's what you do too. So it's, and same with the examples that we've had about cultural diversity. So it's core of, it's not something that we do on top of or in addition to or about making specific or special accommodations for. I'm going to look at a little video here that we've got educators talking about creating a supportive learning environment for the children in their care. Now, some of these children are children with additional needs and others are not, but it's just, I thought, an interesting way to capture, to get an educator's perspective of what's happening in the real world. And I just want to acknowledge the Early Years Connect website that I've drawn on quite heavily as a resource for this presentation. Again, the links to the site are there in the reference list and available to you. It's a fabulous resource, and if you're working in Queensland, it's one that you'll become very familiar with.
I think what's important for us is that face-to-face contact with people, and certainly the core of our work with our families and our children is all around relationships. So from the very beginning, I guess we have modelled to families and to children our acceptance of all the children within the group, regardless of their backgrounds or their needs. And I think building up that really friendly, welcoming environment for everyone has been what's worked most for us in getting that message across that we value everybody within this space.
We work very hard to support children's sense of belonging, that this is a place for them, and that often takes time. For example, one child I really believe has taken about 9 months to really have a sense that this is a safe place for him. So that's been a long, long process of getting to know that child, and for that child getting to know our expectations and what's okay to do, and how to engage with other children, and how to be okay in this environment.
And that initially starts from the first contact that you have with them. So that's usually when they come in to review the centre, to put their name down for our waiting list. So that's a really pivotal time for parents, because they're making that really difficult decision about where they want to put their children. So attachment is really, really important. We need to make sure that we're establishing that really strong connection with them as soon as they walk through that gate. And it's really important that we ensure that they are a big part of our program, because without them, we won't be able to do all of the fantastic things that we do.
The biggest thing, however, over everything is knowing children and having a relationship with that child. And that is the way that you can truly differentiate for a child or support a child in an environment, is to have that trust and that relationship, and not a knowledge just of, well, this child has a disability, because that is one aspect of a child. The complex behaviour is one aspect. It is about knowing the whole child and knowing that this child brings lots of knowledge and experience to kindergarten or to any care setting, and valuing that, and also valuing what else they're interested in their life, what else do they like doing at kindy. So that's really important, and that's the way that you're then able to differentiate and include children, because it is becomes second nature for all the staff, because you know and you have that relationship with that child.
So that brings us to the end of our presentation on topic 8. If you're going to go through and just think about understanding, make sure you have a sound understanding of what those terms mean, that you understand the links between the policies and practices, and can, I guess, identify that there are lots of policies. Some of them are legislation, some of them are standards, some of them are some are laws, acts that you must follow, and I guess so that you've got some sense of what it means to create a supportive learning environment. And as I said, this is the list of references that I have drawn on, and again with particular recognition to the Early Years Connect, State of Queensland's Early Years Connect website, which you can follow that link to.